Hello and welcome to this video as part of the Single Sales Principle membership program. As usual, we're going to go through one of the elements of the Single Sales Principle, and in fact in this one we're going to go through one element of one of the elements of the Single Sales Principle in a great deal of detail. One of the most interesting areas I find in the Single Sales Principle is the way that we deal with objections. And as you will remember, if you've been on the program, and if not, come on the program because it's a fantastic part. It's the process called ERRICA that we use for the 6 steps of handling objections. Now, normally this comes towards the end of the program. How do we deal with objections? And the idea of it coming towards the end of the program is that actually, if we've done our job really well up until this point, people should just be buying anyway. They won't be throwing objections out right at the very last minute. We've been aware of what's been going on right the way through the sales process. And by doing that, we don't have an issue when we get towards the end, when we get to the close. Now, the reality is we don't do our jobs perfectly, and actually sometimes customers are playing little games, either deliberately or subconsciously, where they're going to save things up right to the end, and just when it comes to the point of them saying yes or no, they start to throw these things out. And this is where we use ERRICA. It is one of the most challenging things to use. It's a fantastic tool because when you get the hang of it, when you use it in exactly the order that it's supposed to be used in, it works so well. But the problem is, if you don't stick to the order and you don't practice it enough and you don't break each element down in a great deal of detail, it can feel either really clunky or you just forget parts of it and you skip through and you're still doing the old traditional way of when a customer offers an objection to you, you just drive straight into the end, the A of ERRICA, the answer, without actually going through the 5 steps that come before that. So this video is going to be one of a series of 6 where we actually go through each individual element of ERRICA. Some of them will be shorter than others because some of them are incredibly brief, might even stick a couple together. But the one that we're going to start with is, for obvious reasons, the one right at the very beginning, the first E of ERRICA, which stands for empathy. One of the very first things that we have to do when somebody throws an objection our way is to empathize with it. Empathy essentially means that we're looking at something from somebody else's point of view. We're seeing it through their eyes. We're standing in their shoes. We're looking at it from their position. And if we can start to do that, 2 things happen. One is we get a much clearer picture of what the problem actually is, what the objection might actually mean. And secondly, it starts to build a good solving relationship that we can have. So this problem that has arisen towards the end of the sales process is more likely to be able to be fixed because we're looking at the problem together. We're standing shoulder to shoulder, side by side with people addressing this problem, as opposed to being in a conflict situation about it. But showing empathy at this point is really, really difficult. Because essentially you have just worked your socks off right throughout the sales process. It's all seemed to be going well, you're getting them down towards the close, and all of a sudden they throw a spanner in the works. And it's quite difficult to be empathetic at that point. There are 2 classifications of objections that get thrown out at this point. And the way that we show empathy, the way that we need to show empathy, will be different dependent on what type of classification it is. So the first thing that I want you to think about when you're looking at how to show empathy is what sort of objection is it? And by what sort of objection, it's nothing to do with the technical content of that objection. It's much, much simpler than that. It's much more basic. There's one type of objection that people have where actually, do you know what? We agree with the objection that they've got. They've identified some problem, some issue, some block in terms of them saying yes, and do you know what? We scratch our heads and go, yeah, I can agree with you on that. I know exactly why. That's one classification. The other, of course, is the opposite, which is where we disagree. And it's a really useful thing to do to actually break these 2 apart and say, right, if it's an objection that I agree with, how am I going to handle it? And if it's an objection that I disagree with, how am I going to handle it? And in terms of handling it, we're just going to address it in this video from the point of empathy, the very first element of the ERRICA sales training process. So let's look at this idea of what happens when we agree with the objection that somebody is throwing our way. Well, I'll give you some vague details of an example of this recently. A client of ours had been through the sales training program and had done lots of follow-up coaching work about the use of ERRICA. It was a very high-value item that they were planning to sell, and it kept coming up, this same problem over and over again with different customers. So we workshopped this ERRICA process in a great deal of detail. And the great news is, as a result of doing that, we actually got a phone call from the client saying, do you know what? We've actually managed to get that sale done. That sale has now been made, and it's been made because we used the ERRICA process extremely successfully. The challenge was that the objection that pretty much every customer coming to look at this particular proposition had was A, exactly the same, and B, it was a really valid one that the salesperson themselves kind of agreed with. It was a problem, it was an issue. So how do we go about showing empathy for somebody in a way that actually doesn't just say, yeah, I totally support what you're saying, I wouldn't do it either, let's call it quits. But be able to show empathy for something that we agree with and get the other person to explore it a little bit more before we move on to the next steps in the ERRICA process. The three elements that I want to go through in this session are these. First off, you must show that you're listening. It's a real challenge even when you agree, perhaps particularly when you agree, because number one, you've probably heard all of this before, and number two, you know it, so why do you have to listen to the other person? The second one is we need to change the environment in which we handle this empathetic conversation that is going to happen. That's changing the space. And the third one is just a conversational linguistic tool that we use, which is using the word I when we talk about things. So let's break each of those three things down. The first one, showing that you're listening. We do an awful lot of work as part of the Single Sales Principle program on addressing this idea of how important it is to listen and to be seen to be listening to people. The key to it, when you agree with these sort of objections, is that we need to use whole body listening. Most of our listening is, well, to be fair, not done at all particularly well most of the time. But even when we do switch it on, the majority of the listening that we do is with the use of ears. Now, obviously, that is a good thing to do because this is an auditory environment. People are telling us stuff. Information is going into our brain through our ears. So there's nothing wrong with using ears at all. But we need to use three other areas as well when we're listening to somebody, because they will be telling us some things verbally, but there'll be a lot more communication going on. They will also be telling us things visually, so we need to use our eyes. We need to be really aware of what they're looking at and what their body language is like. So we need to notice what is going on. How are they standing? How are they sitting? What are they doing with their arms? What are they doing with their hands as they're talking about this sort of thing? Is their face scrunching up? Are they worried about something? Is it a concern? Is it something that they're angry about? Are they embarrassed to be talking about this sort of area? We can only show empathy if we become increasingly aware of those messages, the physical messages that people are giving us through what we see, as well as the actual words that they're using. So if we're using ears and we're using our eyes, what else do we need to use? The other one is we need to use our heart. We need to be aware of the feelings that are being generated. The chances are the person who has been through the sales process with you, probably quite a long sales process if we've got to the point of ERRICA on it, the chances are they're thinking, it's a bit uncomfortable, I'm not quite sure what's going on here. If they've got that level of uncertainty, we need to feel what they're feeling. They might be feeling frustrated, they might be feeling annoyed, they might be feeling angry, they might be feeling upset or concerned or worried. Lots of different emotional stuff will come out. And the more we can notice those and get on the same heart level as they are in terms of the feelings that they're having, the more we'll be able to show empathy for it. And that's relatively straightforward to do if it is an objection that we agree with. The fourth one is actually going back to ourselves, and it's thinking about the gut. What is our gut instinct saying about this? And we do pick up a lot of these signals all of the time. We get these sort of little inclinations of, oh, do you know what, I just think this might be the case. The key is to really notice those things. So this first step of listening is this whole body listening using ears, using your eyes, using your heart, and using your gut as well, to make sure that you're getting the fullest possible picture of what it is like to be the other person. That's absolutely critical if we're going to show high quality empathy to somebody else. The second aspect, when again we're agreeing with people, is, do you know what, let's change the environment, let's change the space that we're in. If it is a big problem that we're aware of, that they're aware of, the chances are we need to go and work on it, and we need to work on it together. So rather than do it in the same environment that we've been in throughout the entire sales process, let's change it around a little bit. It doesn't have to be the psychiatrist's chair. We don't have to get them sort of lying back and casting their mind back to childhood or anything like that, although if it works, it works. What we can do, though, is just make some small but significant physical changes to the environment. In a meeting type situation, in an office type situation, that might simply be moving the chair. If it's a standing type situation, moving so that we're looking at the same thing together, looking in the same direction. Or if you've got the opportunity, move the conversation somewhere else. Go and have it over a cup of coffee. Go and change the environment completely. Because by changing that environment, we get away from this sales environment of it having been something that is one person against another person, and move it into somewhere where we are physically in the same space, in a different environment to the one that we've been in so far. So it changes the mood, it changes the tone of what we're going to be talking about and how we're going to be talking about it. And then the third and final one around this area of objections that we kind of agree with is to use the conversational tool of saying, I think, I agree with you. I would think the same in your shoes. Actually make it really personal, because it's very difficult to create an empathetic environment if actually you're not showing your vulnerabilities, you're not showing your side of things, you're not showing how you feel as well. Nobody thinks that you will be empathetic with them if it's all about them. It needs to be a two-way process. So make sure when you're talking about it, you talk about yourself in the first person, using I and me, as well as allowing them to express how they're feeling about things. So that's the sort of way of dealing with objections if you're in a position where you actually agree with what the other person is saying. Let's flip it over now and look at the side where, do you know what, you just completely disagree. They're throwing an objection out and it's ridiculous from your point of view. We do get these quite a lot. People will say things and you just want to hit your head against a brick wall and go, oh, for goodness sake, get over it. Don't worry about it at all. It happens probably more than the type of objections that we agree with. But the very, very first step that we have to take with any of these objections that we disagree with is stop. We need to stop passing judgment on the other person. Because if we start by passing judgment and saying that is a stupid thing to think, that's a ridiculous approach to take, that's a foolish perspective to have on something, then do you know what? Everything that we do afterwards will have that as the back of our mind, going on and on and on about how ridiculous this other person is. We need to not judge them. We need to actually think, I wonder why they think that. And that leads into the first of the three areas that I'm going to talk about with regard to dealing with objections that we fundamentally disagree with. The first is to be curious. Wonder why they're thinking about it like that. They have a different perspective to you. And do you know what? That is actually quite interesting. The second one is to flip the question around, to use some interesting different types of questions to the ones that you would normally ask of people when they're objecting to something, to actually play a little bit of reverse psychology with people. And then the third and final one is, if it is this big objection that you don't agree with, that you haven't come across before, you don't know what the answer is because it's not something that fits into your way of looking at things, don't try and solve it yourself, get them to do it. So again, we're going to break these three down. The first of these is the idea of curiosity. We've got a video in the archive that is specifically around showing curiosity. It's a big, big theme of mine when we're talking to customers. We must be curious about the other person and actually show that we're curious. Ask the question, why? And ask it subtly, why is that? That's really interesting. I've never heard that before. Explain a little more. And by showing that level of curiosity, it actually is empathetic because it's showing that we have a degree of interest in the other person's perspective. And people do like to talk about their thoughts. People do like to talk about how they've come to conclusions at certain times. So allow them the opportunity to do that by demonstrating very clearly that you are really, really curious about how they have come to the conclusions that they've come to. The second is this questioning part. How do we question people a bit differently when essentially what they've done is put a big stamp that says, I reject what you're saying. One of the key questions is to say, okay, so on a scale of 1 to 10, how bad is this problem? You might be a bit nervous about asking that question because the chances are, if they're objecting to something that you have proposed to them, you're going to get a low number. And who honestly wants to hear a, well, you know, 1 or 2 out of 10 is a good thing, or, you know, it's an 8 or 9 out of 10 is a problem. It's a massive problem, this one. Now, if we get a 10 out of 10 as how big is the problem, then we know we've got a big problem to deal with. But the reality is, in most cases, people don't like to say 10 out of 10. It is the absolute ultimate. They'll give you an 8 or a 9 out of 10. And that gives you a little foot in the door. It gives you a little gap to go into to say, I wonder what is not making it a 10. So you can actually ask the question. So if you say, you know, it's sort of on a scale of 1 to 10, how bad is this thing? Well, you know, it's an 8 or a 9 out of 10. All right, why is it not a 10? You need to be quite brave to ask that question. Why is it not as bad as being completely 100% awful? The great thing about asking that question is as soon as you do it, and as soon as you focus the conversation about the gap of why it isn't 100% bad, their mind starts to focus on the small number of slightly good things about it that are stopping things being 100% dreadful. And we start to change the conversation that we're having from being about the negative aspect of something into the tiny, admittedly small bits of positive stuff that they have seen. And it starts to change the conversation a little bit, as well as changing their mindset. Their mind and their focus goes somewhere else if you're asking them to think about even the slimmest bit of positive stuff that they've identified with this particular problem. And then the third and final one is, do you know what? They've come out with this problem, we've done a lot of empathy and these sort of things, but we can't move forward at all because we're really, really struggling. One of the things that we would do before we offer any answers at all, which is the thing that we do only at the very end of the ERRICA process, is to get them to solve the problem. Hand them the Rubik's Cube. They have given you a problem, so what would you do? How would you make it different? And actually challenge them to think about those things. It's a little bit like flipping the question in that you're asking them to come up with solutions. You're asking them to reframe things and look at the positives of stuff rather than the negatives of stuff. It changes the conversation and it changes their mindset as well. Now, all of this is purely around the empathy part of the ERRICA process. In the next few videos, I'm going to be talking to you about the other elements. We're going to talk about refining and repositioning and isolating and committing and getting the answer out right at the very end of the process. But it is absolutely fundamental to remember that the very first thing that we need to do when people come to us with an objection is to empathize with it. If we go in with anything other than empathy, we are setting ourselves up for a fall because we're setting up a conflict situation, which is the last thing that we want to do. People are far more likely to say yes to you if they believe you're on their side. And the best way of being on somebody's side is to show empathy for them and to put yourself in their shoes. Thank you very much for listening. As usual, if you've got any questions, any comments, send us an email, drop us a tweet, reply to something or other, get in touch with us one way or another. There are loads of ways of doing that. Visit lemore.com if you need the contact details. We'd love to hear from you. And if there are any other things you'd like us to talk about in this series of videos, just let us know. Thank you very much.